All right, with a very solid knock on wood, let us hope that this is going to be the last time, at least for a while, that we will be on Zoom for these lectures. So today is Wednesday, January 26th, and this is our last Zoom lecture, at least, well, at least for this week. It's definitely the last Zoom lecture for this week, but hopefully we will be done starting next week as well, because on Monday, unless something dramatic happens between now and Monday, we will be on campus. So remember, we are in room 418. I got that wrong. We corrected it early, well, not early, but by the end of the class last time, but I wanted to make sure we were in the right place. You've at least seen my face, or at least you'll see this much of it. So hopefully that will help. You know you are in the right place. The heart models and stuff like that on the wall will also be a big indicator that you're in the right place as well. Even though we're going to be on campus, we still have homework assignments that are going to be due. And again, it is important to remember that all homework assignments are due at the beginning of class. So I will continue to leave the online option to submit homework assignments that way. That is perfectly acceptable to do that. You are also welcome to, like especially with your lab manuals, the unit reviews, bring those into class. But remember, they are due on my desk at the beginning of class. As soon as I start talking, I grab the stack off the front of my desk, put it into my bag, and any assignment that is turned in after that is late. Again, remember, you can turn in a late assignment, but a late assignment, whether it's 5 days or 5 minutes, is still only half credit. So you do not want to be giving away points. So make sure your alarms are set, make sure you're there on time, or the night before, just submit them into Canvas. We have 2 lab simulations due on Monday, your interactive physiology. I got a couple questions on that one, so I want to make sure you guys understand what is responsible for that. So let's cheat and go to our Canvas site. Remember here under your modules, under the lab simulations, this is also where your PhysioX assignment can be turned in. Remember, there are 5 activities. There are 2 PhysioXs, 5 and 6. 6 is due first. 5 different activities, 5 different lab reports. And remember, you can come here to turn in your lab reports there. So that is an easy place to do that. And that way you save the paper, you save the ink. You don't have to print out those. Because like I said, they're on average about 5 pages per lab report with 5 lab reports. That is 25 pages. If you take that over all the PhysioXs we're going to be doing over the semester, that's a small tree's worth of paper that you are killing to be able to do that. So turning it in online is the easiest way to do that. Also, Ava, yes, you had a question.
So throughout the semester, even when we're in person, we do the PhysioX and the Labsters?
Definitely the PhysioXs. I haven't decided on the Labsters yet. The PhysioXs were something that was already incorporated into the class before we went online. The Labsters were the new part that we've added. Since this part has been half online and half offline, I still want to have us do all the lab simulators. We may trim back some of them, but you absolutely positively will be doing the PhysioX exercises throughout the semester, because that we were doing that before we went online. So that's not a change.
Okay, and when we go back in person, we do the labs that we bring the pages for in our lab manual. Do we turn that in person, or do we turn it on online?
We'll talk about that when we get there. So let's talk about those when we get to that. The other exercise you're going to be doing lab simulation is this interactive physiology. So here for the interactive physiology, again, this is one of the lab tools in your Pearson. So as long as you have your MyLab and Mastering, which you should have, then this link will get you to that interactive physiology. And notice there is a PDF assignment that you can print out or download and fill out. So this is some questions that they have asked, and then I have added some additional questions to this worksheet as well. So you'll be filling out and answering these 8 questions, and then answering this portion for me and you'll be turning that in as well. And since this is 2 pages, if you want to print it out and turn it in, you can. If not, you can just submit it here again as well. So all these things can either be submitted online or in person. All righty. So those are the 2 things that are going to be due Monday when we're in class. And again, we also have a Monday. Yes, I did not put that on here. Sorry. So let's do this. We are also doing a physiology lab in class on that day. That physiology lab that we're doing on that day is based on the activities that are on pages 494 through 515 in your lab manual. So to answer your question, Ava, absolutely, you will be bringing those pages in. For this particular activity, you'll be working in groups. So what'll happen is 3 or 4 of you will be together in a group. You will all fill out one of these set of pages, put all of your names in them. And so usually the labs we're doing in class, because you're doing them as a group, you are filling out as a group and turning in as a group with everybody's name on that lab page. So usually they're due at the end of the lab because you're doing all the activities in the classroom. So that's what we will be doing on Monday. So those are things that make sure you bring that for Mondays, because we're going to be working on that. Now, this is not considered a wet lab, so we don't need the lab coats. We don't need the goggles for this particular activity. So just bring those pages and we will work on that stuff together. However, on Wednesday the 2nd and Monday the 7th, we do have wet labs. Again, remember, for our wet labs, you must have all the things that we normally have to have in the class. So that means closed-toed shoes. You must have a face mask. And again, it must either be an N95, a KN95, or a surgical. Those are the only masks that are acceptable in the class. You can't use a gaiter. You can't use your bedazzled mask or any other type of thing like that. It's one of those 3 and only one of those 3. But again, remember, those are things that must be, it's under the lab simulators. The PhysioX is under the lab simulators in the module. So that is where you will turn in the assignment. Remember, PhysioX you access through the Mastering A&P through the study area. So those are always in the class. These are things that we always have to have. However, because we have a wet lab, during the wet lab, you must have pants or something that covers your legs. As it starts to warm up, you are perfectly welcome to, during a normal lecture, during an exam, during something like that, wear shorts. I will definitely be wearing shorts as things start to warm up. However, we'll always have a break before the wet lab, and during that time, you need to put something on that covers your legs. It can be a long skirt, it can be pants, it can be sweatpants. Sweatpants are easy because you can just throw those over whatever you're normally wearing. You must have, like we talked about, some type of lab coat. Again, as we talked about, that lab coat is going to be something that covers your chest and your arms completely. It should be a lab coat. Lab coats are cool, but again, it can be, like I said, you can go to the Salvation Army and you can get, for $1, the largest flannel shirt that they have there, and that's something that you can use for the semester and throw it away. The key to this lab coat is that what it cannot be is part of your normal wardrobe. It can't be the sweatshirt you've been sitting there wearing all day in class. It can't be your leather jacket that you brought to class on that day. And again, to encourage you to make sure that your lab coat is not part of your normal wardrobe. As I said, if you are not wearing a lab coat, I will have a permanent marker and I will be putting a big black X on whatever it is that you are wearing in the class, just to make sure that it's not your favorite sweatshirt that you're trying to sell me as, no, I don't mind, this is my lab coat, because we're not getting blood and guts and all sorts of other stuff on our normal clothes. So it cannot be part of your normal wardrobe. It must be something that you are using exclusively for an lab coat, and don't mind getting messed up and don't mind throwing away at the end of the semester. So again, I will be marking those up if you're not wearing a real lab coat. Most of you had to buy lab coats for chemistry anyway, so just wear that. So on both of those days, we're going to do the cadaver, definitely. I'm trying to get us hearts to make up the heart dissection that we missed from the January 24th class. So make sure you bring these pages on that day, and hopefully we'll have some hearts to be able to dissect. On Monday the 7th, we are doing a blood typing lab. This is non-biological blood. It is artificial blood, so there is no biological risks associated with it, no pathogens, nothing along those lines. However, it can stain. And because it can stain your normal clothes, we will need our lab coats. And then, of course, you also need goggles. Those goggles must have a splash guard, so it can't just be your normal glasses like I'm wearing here. It has to have something that has the splash guard on it. And you must have some type of disposable gloves. I will tell you right now, again, we prefer nitrile gloves, but I will warn you that our classroom is not a latex-free environment. I know some students have latex sensitivities, so you need to be aware that some of the models, some of the materials in the classroom do have latex in them. So since the classroom is not a latex-free environment, we do not preclude students from bringing latex gloves. So as I've said many times for this class, whatever gloves, disposable gloves you can steal from work, those are the ones that you should bring. If you don't have a job where you can steal gloves from, then once you form, excuse me, once you form your groups that are going to be working together, if you guys all have similar size hands and want to just buy one box of gloves that you're all going to share for the semester, that is fine as well. But you need some type of disposable gloves, right? I'm not talking about the orange kitchen gloves you wash your dishes with, disposable gloves. All right. So on both the 2nd and the 7th, we are going to be doing wet labs. So come prepared for that and hopefully the heart. On Wednesday, 2nd, 2 exercises due. Unit 17 is due, and also your cardiovascular exercises. And remember that cardiovascular exercise is going to be graded for correctness. So that, again, on unit reviews, I'm looking for effort. I'm looking for time that you put into that. It's a learning experience. Cardiovascular exercise, a wrong answer will lose you points. That's not the case for the Unit 18s. That's not the case for the lab simulators. Most of our homework, I'm looking for time and effort, but every once in a while, and this is one of those, I will grade something for correctness, which should give you an indication of its importance. Monday the 7th, we have our Unit 19 review due, our PhysioX exercise 5 due, which has 7 activities. Again, these PhysioXs, for those of you who haven't started them yet, they're not hard, but they're not, they're time consuming. Doing 5 activities, doing 7 activities take time. So it's not the kind of thing you typically want to save till 11 o'clock at night before our 8 o'clock in the morning class, because you're not going to get a whole heck of a lot of sleep. And then, of course, the Labsters, not only are they due, do you do them online, but remember, it automatically submits it to Canvas, which brings me to another point, a couple emails I got. Again, for full credit, you must do 100% of the activity and get it 80% correct. However, one of the nice things about Labster is it is synced with Canvas. So as soon as you complete the activity, it submits it. Now, if you only get 90% correct when you're doing it, when it automatically submits it to Canvas, it's going to give you 18 out of 20 points because that's 90%. I will then manually go back in and adjust it to full credit. So I know some of you have seen your scores and been worried because you didn't get the full credit, even though you met that criteria. That's because I have to go back and manually change it. And I typically don't do that till I'm grading the assignments and I'm behind on my grading. So for your first Labster, if you haven't seen those changes, it's just because I haven't done it yet. As long as you do the entire activity and get it at least 80% correct, so as long as you're getting 16 points on it, I will change that to 20. You will get full credit. If you get less than 16 points, you're not getting full credit for it. So make sure, remember, you can do it again and improve your score. Lastly, this all leads us up into Wednesday, the 9th, where we have our lab and lecture exam. Again, as we talked about at the last class, it is going to be a station-based exam. So again, we'll be working around the classroom. That means you will be tested on the models and the charts and the other materials that are in the classroom. So luckily we'll have a week and change to try to get some opportunity. There will also be the open lab on on Wednesday, the 4th, to be able to get in there and study and spend some extra time with those materials. But notice that also means that the 5th and 6th is your big weekend to study that material. We are going to be going over some new material on the 7th. I'm going to try to limit how much it is, but you will be getting some new material 2 days right before the exam. Now, I'll remind you, on that weekend before, you have the lecture outlines, you have the materials that are, you can see exactly what we're going to be talking about. So there is absolutely positively no reason you can't start looking ahead so that the material that I'm presenting on the 7th isn't brand new. If the material is brand new to you on the 7th, then that's going to be much more challenging to master it by the 9th, 2 days later. But if you've already looked at it ahead of time, even if you don't understand all of it, but if you've looked at some of it ahead of time, it'll help you to synthesize that material and be more successful on that Wednesday exam. All right. Also, the other thing that'll happen when we have Wednesday exams, because we don't meet again for 5 days, and I can't have you go in 5 days without thinking about anatomy and physiology. There will be some type of, let's say it this way, a preview activity that you will be responsible for doing to help you to prepare and get ready for when we come back to the second section of the class. And that is going to be due on, it would then be Monday, what would that be, the 14th. But I'll tell you what that assignment is when we get closer to that. So that'll give you an opportunity to take a good, 2 to 3 hour break after the lab and lecture exam, and then dive right into studying for the next section of the class. All right. Questions on any of that?
I do have a quick question.
Yes.
There are practice quizzes on Pearson, right?
Yes, the Mastering A&P does have, now my understanding is they're all multiple choice and maybe some fill in the blank. So obviously they're not the essay questions that you're going to have on your exams, but absolutely those chapter quizzes and chapter reviews, obviously I didn't make them. So again, it's possible that some of those questions might ask questions about material that I'm not holding you responsible for, but then you just ignore those questions. But yes, I think that those are a great way of helping you to prepare. One of the challenges with multiple choice questions is almost by definition, they're tricky, right? Because if it was a completely straightforward statement, then it would be way too easy. So they always have that, that trap answer where if you misread one word or you misinterpret one part of the question, they've got that trap answer to catch you. I know students prefer multiple choice questions, but I prefer essay questions. The magic of an essay question is partial credit. As long as you know some of the information, you're going to get some of the points. With a multiple choice question, you could completely understand the concept. Heck, your uncle could have been the one that discovered it. You could have had your picture taken, whatever that concept is, but you misread one word, you misinterpret the question, and you get it wrong, and you don't show me that you have that knowledge. So yes, you have to be careful and read multiple choice questions carefully. So having things like those reviews to check them is an awesome way to prepare. But be aware, Pearson makes those, not me. So I'm not, but yeah, absolutely. Bill, go ahead.
So I know we have all these materials to kind of read to help us get successful in the exam. Which one would you prefer to be more focused on, the lecture, on the A&P book, or on the exploring A&P book? Is there a specific study, whatever?
Well, so okay, so there is the contrite answer to your question, and that is you need to know everything, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
But it's really not entirely true. What you need to know is the material that we cover in this class, right? Like I said, I see my job as a tour guide. My job is to tell you the things that I think are important, and those are the things that are going to be on the exam, right? We spent a majority of the last class talking about action potentials in conductive and contractile cells. We talked about the cardiac conduction system, right? Those are the big concepts we talked about. And you can be fairly certain there are going to be essay questions about those on the exam, right? So it's one of the things I like about this class is hard. I can tell you X, Y, and Z is going to be on the exam because I know you're still going to have to spend a tremendous amount of time studying X, Y, and Z. In the lab, it's a little bit easier because I'm giving you a list of the material that you're responsible for. Certainly that list of blood vessels looks impressive when you look at it, but is that truly a list of every single blood vessel in your body? No, if you look in your textbook, if you look in your lab manual, you'll find dozens upon dozens of blood vessels that are listed on there that aren't on the list that I gave you. And you are welcome and free to ignore all of them. It's the same thing with the lectures. The lecture slides are probably the best study guide for the lectures. They remind you of all the big important concepts, right? Now, is everything you need to know about those concepts on those slides? No, it's an outline, basically, is what those are. It just reminds us of the things that we need to talk about on those days. So that is the best study tool to use for doing that. Now, if you didn't understand the action potential in the conductive cell of the heart, then your textbook is an amazing resource to go to learn about it. Your interactive physiology is a great resource. All the stuff on mastering A&P. So there are other places, other tools you have to go to read about these concepts and to sort of master them so that you are prepared. But yeah, the things we talk about, the things we cover in class, those are the things that are most important, and those are the things that are going to be on the exam. All right. Any other questions on this and our game plan moving forward? All right, then let us dive into lecture. We left off last time, as I just mentioned, talking about the cardiac conduction system. We talked about the 5 main structures that make them out, and they play an important role, not just in producing the electrical activity that is going to drive the mechanical activity of the heart, but directing that electrical activity in a very precise and specific way so that the heart beats as efficiently and effectively as possible. And at the end of the last class, we mentioned how, just like an electrician working in your house, we have the ability to stop this. Sorry, my windows are messing up. All right. We have a way to measure that movement of electrical activity. And that's really what that electrocardiogram, again, an ECG or an EKG, whether you like the American or the German version of this. Remember, what we are measuring is basically the change in state of cells. Not sure why all of that isn't. So when a cell depolarizes, when a cell repolarizes, this is what it is measuring. So it measures the movement, but primarily the change in the membrane potential of cells. And it's that change that is key. Remember, we are also measuring electrical activity. We know, as we talked about, that when a muscle cell is stimulated, it is going to contract and produce a force. But the instant it is stimulated, is it instantly producing a force?
No.
No. So we know that electrical activity leads to mechanical activity, but they're not the same. And so it's important to understand that the ECG is not a direct measure of the movements or the contractions of the heart. We know they're going to lead to it, We know that when the atrial gets excited, it is going to contract. But this ECG is not a measurement of the contraction. It's a measurement of the change in electrical activity. And I think one of the easiest ways to see this is to take this electrocardiogram and draw it out and dissect the different deflections. Notice this is not a straight line. It has these different deflections on them. And there are three main deflections or formations that we want to identify. So let's actually go to our whiteboard and do this. And again, don't use ECG on the exam. Spell it out. Spelling matters. Abbreviations don't count. So the first part, we have a flat line, and then we have our first deflection. And our first deflection is what is known as the P wave. This P wave is the measure of the, here, it's a little bit smaller, so I have room for all of this. It's a measure of the depolarization of the atria. All right. Notice a depolarization is a change in membrane potential. And if a cell depolarizes, is it getting more positive or more negative?
Positive.
More positive, excellent. So let's dissect this P wave for a second. At this point right here, let's go ahead and put it there just to exaggerate. What percentage of our atrial cells are depolarized?
Zero.
Yeah. Excellent. That was easy enough. So here, and I'm going to move it over here even more to get it out of my way. Then this starts to happen, and let's exaggerate this. When the very beginning of that deflection starts, how many cells are depolarized there?
A little.
Yeah, a little. So, I mean, let's exaggerate. Let's say 1%. Now, am I at the place where it's probably 1%? Probably not. Who knows? But the point is, this is where we see the start of the change. So if this is 1%, then is this up here at the top 100%?
No.
No? Isn't that the peak? Isn't the peak the top?
Can't reach depolarization.
Say again?
I don't think it's able to like fully depolarize at the very top. 100%.
You are 100% correct. This is not, this point right here, hold on, let me cheat. This is not the point where 100% is depolarized. This is the point where the most change is occurring. However, where would be the point where we are at 100% depolarized? Nope, not R, although that's a good guess. We'll get to that. We'll get to R in a second. We're just focusing on P right now. Where do you think the point where 100% of the cells of the atria are all depolarized? T is a good guess as well. Nope. Turns out it is right. Oh, no, can't have that. Here. This curve is a measure of change. Notice at this point right here, how much change are we measuring? The line is flat. How much change are we measuring?
None.
None, exactly. And so at this point, 100% of the atrial cells are depolarized. And if 100% of the atrial cells are depolarized, there's no more change. And if there's no more change, our curve becomes flat. Remember, the ECG is a measure of change. So the P wave starts with the beginning of the depolarization of our atrial cells, and then it ends once all the atrial cells are depolarized. Now, shouldn't this wave then continue into the ventricles? Why aren't we seeing the change in the ventricle? Why is this line flat right here? Why do we have this flat period? Isn't electric?
No
Go ahead.
change.
Right. Why is there no change? Shouldn't our wave of electrical activity be continuing through the heart? Why is there a delay? You're absolutely right, Mitch, but why is there a delay? What's slowing the signal down?
Short fibers.
Short, small, tiny fibers, short, small, tiny conductive cells that are bundled together in what structure?
The AV node?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The reason we have this flat part right here is because of the delay from the AV node. And again, don't write out AV node, spell out atrioventricular. I'm using abbreviation so it all fits on the page here. But absolutely, that signal is delayed in getting to the ventricle. And so because it's not moving, because it's been slowed down, we're not able to measure the change. So as we said, the P wave is the measure of the depolarization of the atria, going from 0 cells depolarized to 100% of the cells depolarized. And we have measured that change. Questions on that? If this doesn't make sense, it's just going to get worse from here. All right, excellent. So our next deflection, we get this downward point that comes to what we call the Q point. We'll talk about what that Q is in just a second. That then leads into our biggest peak, and I kind of shorted myself here. This should probably be longer than this, taller than this, but I wanted to have enough writing room underneath where I've shorted myself a little bit. This big peak, as someone mentioned earlier, is our R deflection. And then it comes down to another downward peak known as the S before it levels off again. I mention these three together because these three collectively are what we refer to as the QRS complex. Now, let's talk a little about the QR complex. The Q deflection is when our electrical signal reaches the apex of the heart. As we know, it was being slowed by that atrioventricular node, but then it travels down the bundle of His, down the branches to the apex of the heart. And of course, once it reaches the apex of the heart, then our QRS complex is going to be shown because two combined things are occurring at the same time. Obviously, once our electrical signal reaches the apex, it can spread to the walls of the ventricle. And as it spreads to the wall of the ventricle, it is going to depolarize the ventricle. Which is good, because as we already know, when you depolarize these cells, they're going to contract. We just finished depolarizing the atria, so we know that's going to lead to a contraction. And now we're going to depolarize the ventricles, and that is going to lead to a contraction. However, do we want our atrials and our ventricles contracting at the same time?
No.
So what is the second event that is occurring at the same time as the depolarization of the ventricles?
The repolarization of the atria.
Exactly. Right? They go back to the resting membrane potential. That's what makes this QRS look so funny. Notice our P was a nice curve where we saw a few cells changing and then more and more cells changing until so many cells changed that there's only a few cells left to measure the change in. So fewer and fewer cells are changed till finally all the cells are changed. I think of it as if you had 20 quarters on the table in front of you, and you flip the first one from a head to a tail. They're all heads. You flip the first one from a head to a tail, and that causes two more to flip, and that causes two more to flip, and that causes two more to flip. Notice the number of cells that are becoming tails becomes more and more and more and more, until you get to the point where you've got, like, you know, once you go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 4 and 4 to 8, right? If we're doing the math there, 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 4 is 7, plus 8 is 15. How many more cells do you have? I mean, how many more coins do you have to flip? We started with 20. 20 minus 15 is
5.
5. There's only 5 more to flip. So if I flip 3 of those, I just finished flipping 8, but now I only flip 3, I'm noticing less change. Then I flip 2, less change. Then I flip the last one, and now I'm down to 0. All of them have been changed to tails. That's what we're measuring. We're measuring the number of cells that are changing. And we get a nice simple wave because it's just happening in one part of the heart. But here, we're flipping coins in 2 different places. We have our quarters in the atria, but we have dimes in the ventricles. And some of them are going from heads to tails, while others are going from tails to heads. So we have all this combo thing of these two events that are occurring at the same time, the repolarization of the atria and the depolarization of the ventricle. And so it's a much more complex movement of electrical activity, and it gives us a much more complex deflection, our QRS complex. All right. Questions on that? All right. We have depolarized all of our cells of our atria. We then repolarized all the cells of our atria. We have depolarized all the cells of ventricle. What's left to do? Repolarize the ventricle, absolutely. So our third and final deflection, we are going to repolarize the cells of the ventricle. All right. And this third and final deflection is called the T wave. Now, when we did the P wave, the cells got more positive. So notice our wave went up. It got more positive. In our repolarization of the ventricle, the cells are getting more negative. Does that mean my wave is going to go down? Is this going to go down because these cells are getting more negative?
No, it's coming up.
Yeah, it goes up because it's not measuring membrane potential. What is it measuring?
The change.
Change, exactly. It is measuring change. Let's finish what we were doing before. At this point right here, and again, we'll actually leave it on this one here. Let's cheat and do this. At this point, we already know that 100% of our atrial cells are depolarized. So let's add to that. What percentage of our ventricular cells are depolarized at this point?
None.
Exactly. Perfect. So before our QRS complex, that is a state. After our QRS complex, what is the state of our atrial cells? How many are depolarized? At the end, 0. Excellent. Great, Sarah. 0% of our atrial cells are depolarized. And what percentage of our ventricular cells are depolarized? 100%. Excellent. Perfect. And so then, of course, we can look at our next flat point where, again, no change is taking place. What percentage of our ventricular cells are depolarized here?
0.
Yep. Excellent. So notice these curves measure the change that is occurring. And when our ECG line is flat, that is the points where there is no change taking place. We've done this here, but your book actually does an excellent job of showing this stuff as well. So like we said, P wave is when that first electrical signal is produced and spreading across the atria. QRS complex is when that electrical activity is spreading through the ventricles, but also when our atria are repolarizing, going back to rest. Oops. And the T wave is when that electrical activity goes away in the ventricles. Now, as I mentioned, your book's got these great pictures that show us this. Notice our P wave is when we are getting this change in the atria. There's a little bit of change as it just starts coming out, and then more and more and more and more change until ultimately all the cells of the atria are excited, at which point we hit that part where there's no change. Notice, remember, it's not spreading down to the atria because of that collagenous skeleton that forms that wall, that barrier that stops the electrical activity from spreading on its own. Instead, it is reliant on the atrioventricular node and the atrioventricular bundle. But there is a delay. These cells are tiny. These cells are small, have a high resistance, so it slows the signal down. And while that signal is slow, we don't measure any change. It then reaches the apex of the heart. And again, remember that reaching of the apex of the heart is that Q, whoops, that's horrible, is that Q stage. And then from there, basically two things happen. Our electrical activity, the depolarization spreads up the ventricles. At the same time, the atrial cells are repolarizing. And so these two changes, the atria getting more negative, the ventricles getting more positive. This spread of two different changes happening at the same time give us this complicated wave, which is why it's called the QRS complex, because it's complicated because two things are happening at the same time. Notice we hit another plateau phase where there's no change. This is where we are getting that sustained contraction. Remember, we talked about how these cells are going to have a prolonged excitation that will lead to that prolonged efficient pumping mechanism. So while the ventricles are excited, they're going to be contracting, giving us that nice efficient pump. But eventually, we are going to start to see the repolarization of the ventricles. Again, starting with no cells being repolarized to the point where all the cells are repolarized. And again, notice that even though this change here, the cells are getting more positive, and this change here, the cells are getting more negative. Remember, we're not measuring membrane potential. We are measuring change. And so we're seeing an increase in change and then a decrease in change until all the change has gone away. At which point the entire heart is in a state of being relaxed, being at resting membrane potential until what happens?
The next P wave.
Exactly. And then what's going to happen is, as we know, our higher spontaneous rate sinoatrial node fires another action potential, spreads that action potential via gap junctions to the contractile cells around it. And absolutely, you're 100% correct. That is going to lead exactly to the next P wave. And the whole process continues. Awesome. And so here we see the pretty picture all together. Now, we now know what is happening in the heart in these instances and what these deflections and flat lines mean. And can we take meaning from them? From their shape, from their size, from their length of time, things along those lines? Yeah, we can. It can tell us stuff about what's happening with the heart. Again, remember, it doesn't tell us the mechanical activity. It relates to the mechanical activity. But is the movement of electrical activity in the heart important? Absolutely. So can we use this ECG as a diagnostic tool to kind of get some understanding of what's going on? Absolutely. When diagnosing, actually, let's start, we'll do it here. When diagnosing our electrocardiogram, not only do we worry about the deflections, but we also have what are known as segments and what are known as intervals. And actually, you know what? Let's do this here instead. Let's go back to the whiteboard. Move this up a little bit, and then I can write this here. So we have segments and we have intervals. When we talk about segments and intervals, the easiest way that I remember them is that I intervals, I include the waves. So an interval includes the wave, whereas a segment is between the waves. So this first flat part we were talking about, and I'll go ahead and highlight it in blue. How do you think we would identify this region of time, this amount of time right here?
Segment.
Okay, but what, you're absolutely correct. It is a segment.
Would it be the PQ segment?
It would indeed be the PQ segment, absolutely. Now, here's the fun question. Why might the PQ segment be something important to measure? What is the PQ segment an indication of? What does it tell us?
Time for depolarize.
True, absolutely. But I think Mitch has got it a little bit more accurately in the way they described. Absolutely. What this is specifically defining for us is this tells us the delay of the AV node. This tells us how long our signal is being delayed. And could it be a bad thing if the signal was being delayed too long? Or if this delay was, if the signal wasn't delayed long enough?
Yes.
Absolutely. So knowing this PQ segment could be something that would be important. Absolutely. So I'll move this over here because I've got some more fun drawing to do. On the other hand, what if I did something like this from here? And I'll just go ahead and draw it straight from here to here. What would you call that?
PQ interval?
There you go. Why might the PQ interval be important? What is this a measure of?
Measure of depolarization.
Okay, that's part of it. It is telling us about the depolarization of the atria. However, is the depolarization of the atria completely done at Q? No, it was completely done at the end of the P wave. So it includes the atria. So let's start with that. This is a measure. If you think about where it starts, This is a measurement of the beginning of the depolarization of the atria to what's happening at that Q. What did I say about that Q deflection?
The electric signal and also the depolarize for ventricle.
Exactly. Remember, Q is when the electrical signal reaches the apex of the heart. And so from there, it is going to start to depolarize the ventricle. So notice what the PQ interval tells us is it's the amount of time from the beginning of the depolarization of the atria to the beginning of the depolarization of the ventricle. So notice you can see why these segments and intervals might be important. It's not just the deflections that are important, but it is also the intervals and the segments. Now notice this one in particular is one that is really, really important and one that doctors look at a lot. However, while we're here in the classroom, we talk about this. When you're in the emergency room or you're actually in your doctor's office, what they actually tend to look at more is the PR interval. So while this is an important measurement, typically they use the PR interval. Why?
I have a quick question.
I have a quick answer.
How can they skip the Q and just go to PR, not PQR?
No, well, again, you're measuring the time in this case, and I'll use green for this. You are measuring the time basically from the beginning of P to R. So instead of measuring the time from P to Q, they measure the time from P to R. So why will they in real world use PR much more often than PQ?
Because that is started from depolarized P wave and depolarized until repolarized.
True, but if you think about it, R is kind of in the middle of the depolarization and repolarization. Is that really the best indicator for what we'd want? You guys are overthinking this. If you were looking at a real ECG, why would you want to use PR instead of PQ?
Because need to this resting area too.
I really like where you're going with these and when you're thinking, but nope, that's not actually it. It's actually even simpler than that.
Just gives you more information?
Doesn't give you more information. If you were looking, notice I've made my ECG huge and I've drawn it very, very pretty. Is this actually how big the ECG is on the chart when they're looking at it?
No.
No, it's that tiny little strip of paper. And is it actually going to be this pretty?
No.
No. And is there a massive amount of time that is between the Q and the R deflection?
Oh, no.
No. So why would you use PR instead of PQ?
So it's easier to
Exactly.
measure.
It's way easier to see the R deflection than it is the Q deflection. So they use it because it's easier. We're talking about a couple milliseconds. When we're talking about major differences and changes, is again the difference between Q and R on a real ECG going to be a significant difference in time? No, but it's way, way easier. So when you're out in the real world, you may hear them talk more about the PR than the PQ. What they're really measuring is the PQ because they're interested in how long it takes the electrical signal to spread from the very beginning of the depolarization of the atria to the very beginning of the depolarization of the ventricle. Just the R is easier to read on the graph. If you notice these things give us significant understanding of the electrical activity and why they might be important. And in fact, if we cheat and we go back to our modules and back to our interactive physiology assignment, If you notice, the whole second page is describing intervals and segments, what they indicate as far as the movement of electrical activity, why they might be important. And then remember, we can use them to relate to the electrical activity. It's not a direct measure. Is the P wave a direct measure of the contraction of the atria? No, but does the P wave cause, or that spread of electrical activity that across the atria cause the atria to contract?
Yes.
Yeah, so while we know the P wave is going to cause it to contract, if we measured the P wave precisely, would we know exactly how long the contraction of the atria of the heart would be? No, this is not a measure of the time that it would take for the atria to contract, but we know it's going to cause the atria to contract. So again, remember, we know mechanical is related to the electrical. It's just not a direct measure. So again, not direct measure, but the electrical activity leads to the mechanical activity. We know when cells excite, they contract. We know when they repolarize, they relax.
So if they're relaxed, there's no mechanical activity, correct? Or is there still some small bit?
So again, if you think, and we will talk about the mechanical activity, but let's think of it this way. Let's put it out here so that we know we're pretty safe. At this point at the end, remember, right here at this instant right here, all the cells of the heart are now repolarized. However, the instant a cell repolarizes, it instantly relax?
No.
No, we know it takes time to put that calcium back into the cytoplasmic reticulum or to kick it out of the cell. And so it takes some time for the tension to come back down to zero. But eventually, once all the cells are back to the resting membrane potential, is the heart going to be in a complete state of relaxation? Yeah, absolutely. And then it starts over again. Contraction of the atria, contraction and relaxation, contraction of the ventricle, relaxation of the atria, relaxation of the ventricle, back to a state of everything being in rest again. And we will talk about the mechanical activity. The mechanical activity is important. This just isn't a direct measurement of it. All right. So I mentioned some of these. Like I said, that PQ interval, but like I said, out in the real world, they tend to use PR, is the beginning of the atrial excitation to the beginning of the ventricular excitation. The ST segment, notice between this plateau phase, that gives us an idea of how long the ventricle's entire muscle myocardium is excited, and that can give us an indication of how long and how strong the contraction is of the heart pumping the blood out. QT interval would be the measurement of, so again, if you think about the QT, we didn't draw that one, but this is, remember, when the very first cell of the ventricle gets excited all the way to the point where the very last cell of the ventricle is excited. So it gives us an idea of how long the ventricle is excited for. So all of these intervals and segments can have some significance, and you'll be defining them and talking about them on that ECG assignment.
So I noticed that the ECG assignment did ask about the relation between the mechanical and the electrical. Would you just state that it causes the mechanical?
Exactly. So again, the P wave, for instance, if you're asked to define the P wave, we know is the measurement of the change of the depolarization of the cells of the atria. And as we talked about, we know that the depolarization of those are going to lead to the contraction of the heart, but it's just not a direct measure of how much time it is. Like we talked about, that ST segment that it was in between, that gives us an indication of how long the ventricle is in a state of full excitation for. So the longer it is, the longer the contraction of the ventricle is going to be, or the stronger the contraction of the ventricle is going to be. But is it a direct measure of how long it's contracting for? No. So again, that's the key with that assignment. I want you to talk about the mechanical activity that is related to them. But again, it's not a direct measure of them. But yeah, we know when a cell gets excited, it's going to contract. We know when a cell repolarizes, it's going to relax. So we definitely know that electrical leads to the mechanical. It's just not a direct measure. We can't use the numbers of the milliseconds to know how long the heart is doing what it's doing. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. And so as we mentioned, that is what an electrocardiogram in a healthy person should look like. What it should not look like is what we're looking at here. This is what we would be measuring, for instance, in ventricular fibrillation. A fibrillation is a very rapid, irregular contraction of muscle fibers from a lack of synchronism. Remember, this is supposed to work as a wave. We start with the AV node, spreads through the atrium, spreads to the SA node, spreads through the atrium to the AV node, AV bundle, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje, and we get this nice continuous wave that is going. However, if all the cells are firing out of sync with each other, you get not only an electrocardiogram that looks like this, but if you talk to cardiovascular surgeons who are looking at the heart while the heart is doing this, they say it looks like a bag of wiggling worms because all the different parts of the heart are contracting at different times and at different organizations. So there's no synchrony. And so as we talked about, what do they do when the heart's in that situation?
Shock it.
Yeah, clear. Boom. The goal is to get all the cells to excite at the same time so that they all repolarize at the same time, so that then that SA node, the one that's supposed to be the fastest, can start the signal and start our normal wave again. So that is the goal, is to get reestablish that synchronism by getting all the cells to fire together, all relax together, so that the faster cells can start the cycle and reestablish a normal heart rate. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. Let's actually go back to this picture. I like this picture better. Let's go ahead and take our first break at this time. One teeny bit long, but we'll take a full 15-minute break. Let's come back at, that'll be 9:32, and at 9:32 we'll restart, and I will start the recording at that time. So any questions before we take our first break? All right, I'll see you in 15 minutes. So this is where we took our break, because here is where we get to some of the stuff where, again, people's eyes glaze over. And it's better when they glaze over right at the beginning as opposed to the end. So let's make this a little simple. As we've mentioned before, we know, so let's actually go to the whiteboard to do this. We know that the basal heart rate is determined by essentially the sinoatrial node, but we'll say the cardiac conduction system. But as we know, it's primarily the sinoatrial node, being the part that is most spontaneously active. That is the part that drives the rate. And as we talked about, somewhere around, it has a basal rate of somewhere around 100 beats per minute. Oops. But we know that it can be influenced, modified, changed, whatever word you want to do, by hormones and the autonomic nervous system. Excellent. We haven't talked about hormones yet in this class, so we'll leave that aside for a second and talk first about how our autonomic nervous system affects the heart. Now, what are the two branches of the autonomic nervous system again?
Sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Excellent. Let's start with some of the easy stuff. What is the effect that the sympathetic nervous system has on the heart rate?
Increase.
Excellent. Increases the heart rate. And so, of course, that means because they're antagonistic. Oops. So helps if I can spell. What is the effect of the parasympathetic on the heart rate?
Decrease.
See how easy this is? Not scary at all. Excellent. Let's go to the next step. How? We learned this in the last class. How is it exactly that our sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate?
Hormones.
Okay. Although remember, our autonomic nervous system doesn't release
sorry.
hormones per se, it releases neurotransmitter. And specifically, what neurotransmitter? Norepinephrine, excellent. And what was the effect of that norepinephrine? What did it actually do to make the heart beat faster?
It opened the gated channels.
What kind? What kind of channels did it open? Was it calcium channels that opened by the norepinephrine? Sodium, there you go.
Sodium.
It opened those sodium channels, exactly. And when we open those sodium channels, what happened to the basal rate of the conductive cells that caused the heart to beat faster?
It increases the heart rate. Is it the hip?
Well, what did it do? What change did we see in that conductive cell that caused it to beat faster?
It depolarizes the cell.
Yeah, there you go. This depolarizes the cell. So that, remember, reaches threshold faster. And when it reaches threshold faster, it produces more action potentials. Or produces, let's say it this way, produces action potentials more quickly. That makes sense? Yay, nay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let's do the same thing here. How? Well, we're going to guess that indeed it is going to release a neurotransmitter. However, in the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, what was the neurotransmitter it released?
Acetylcholine.
Excellent. And what was the effect of that acetylcholine?
Opens chlorine channels.
Excellent.
Is it
And
chloride? Chlorine.
I'm sorry?
Is it chloride? Chlorine.
Chloride ions.
Chlorine. Okay.
Chloride ions. Chloride channels, absolutely. And so that causes the cell to depolarizes, or let's say it this way, slows the depolarization of the conductive cell. So it reaches threshold slower. So this causes it to produce action potentials more slowly. And the heart slows down. All right. Again, this is a different way to organize the material that we've talked about, but there isn't actually any new information on the board. We've already talked about all of this, and so hopefully this is making some semblance of sense. Now, here is where we have to go back to 430, and I'll start here to make it a little bit easier for you. What we need to worry about and remember from 430 is the pathway. We know that our autonomic nervous system uses two cells, a preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, to get that information. But if my parasympathetic nervous system wants to send a signal to my heart to tell it to beat more slowly, what is the actual pathway? What is the nerve that carries that information from the brain to, or from the medulla at least, to the heart? What is the pathway for the parasympathetic output? Perfect, Mitch, absolutely. Vagus nerve. What's the other name we could give the vagus nerve?
Cranial nerve 10.
Cranial nerve 10, excellent. And remember, as we talked about in 430, in fact, about 90% of the parasympathetic output travels out the vagus nerve. So that makes that one pretty easy. It basically goes from our brainstem and it basically innervates both the sinoatrial node and it innervates the AV node, the atrioventricular node. And so by opening up chloride channels on the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node, it is able to slow those action potentials and slow down our heart rate. Awesome. That wasn't too scary, hopefully. Hopefully that fired a couple synapses and remind you of that vagus nerve you learned about in 430. But here's where we get the complaining. Because I know you didn't like it in 430 when we had to learn this pathway. But here it gets even worse. What is the pathway for the sympathetic nervous system? Does anybody remember the pathway for the sympathetic nervous system to get that signal basically from our brain, or really from our spinal cord to the heart? Does anybody remember the pathway from the spinal cord to the heart? You had me for 430. You definitely had an essay question where this was one of the pathways you were responsible for. So anybody from my class remember, and anybody from any of the other people who had good 430 instructors remember their pathway from the spinal cord to the heart for the sympathetic nervous system?
Does it have anything to do with the Rami communications?
Absolutely, right? We remember we leave the spinal cord, we go down the white ramus to what? What did the white ramus take us to?
The spinal nerve.
Well, it's not spinal nerve,
No.
chain ganglia. There you go. We had the chain ganglia. But did any old chain ganglia innervate the heart? What were, and I'll give you a hint, there were two chain ganglia that are capable of innervating the heart. Anybody remember them? Remember, the chain ganglia are the ones that line up along our vertebral column. So some of them are sacral, some of them are lumbar, some of them are thoracic, and some of them were cervical.
Cervical.
So which cervical chain ganglia innervate the heart? There you go. Middle and inferior chain ganglia, cervical chain ganglia, where they synapse. And then what is the actual nerve that then leaves that middle and inferior cervical chain ganglia to innervate the heart? What did we call that nerve that left there? Anybody remember? This should be the easy question.
Is it just the central nerve?
Nope. Oh, Sarah's got it. It's just the sympathetic nerve. The sympathetic nerve then goes to the heart. Now, here is one more interesting thing about the sympathetic pathway. Our sympathetic pathway, this sympathetic nerve, innervates both the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. And it innervates the Purkinje fibers. Now notice, just like the parasympathetic, by innervating the atrioventricular and the sinoatrial node, we can increase heart rate. What would the effect of innervating the Purkinje fibers be? So I know you guys are all overwhelmed by the pathway because none of you remembered all that stuff because you thankfully purged that information from your brain when we were talking about it, although a couple of people were able to pull it out. But think of it this way. When that bear with an axe walks into your room, not only does your heart beat faster, but what else does it do?
Dilates blood vessels.
True, but yes, there are lots of other effects, but I'm thinking specifically about the heart. What effect does it have on the heart?
Pumps more blood.
Harder. Not only does it beat faster, but it beats harder. When you're scared, can't you feel your heart pounding against your chest? Not only is it beating harder, faster, but it's beating harder. And that's exactly what happens. Our sympathetic nervous system, unlike the parasympathetic, doesn't just make the heart beat faster, but it also makes the heart beat stronger. So not only is it beating heart faster, but also stronger, pumping even more blood out. And so notice by pumping stronger, it increases the blood that's going into the blood vessels. So this will also indirectly increase blood pressure. Notice our sympathetic nervous system, by making the heart beat faster, can also affect blood pressure. Can our parasympathetic affect blood pressure the same way? I'm sorry, this is a direct. Does our parasympathetic contracting slower affect the blood pressure the same way? No. Which brings us to our last caveat we'll get to in a little bit. If you remember, sympathetic also innervates the smooth muscle of the blood vessels. And if we change the volume or the diameter of the blood vessels, not only do we change the flow and direction of blood, but that also, again, directly affects blood pressure. Does our parasympathetic innervate blood vessels? No. There are a couple exceptions, but primarily we'll put a big asterisk there because there are a couple that innervates we talked about. Anybody remember what blood vessels our parasympathetic nervous system innervates?
The digestive.
It's a great guess, but nope.
Oh, the lungs.
Nope. Another great guess, but nope. You were correct in that our parasympathetic nervous system is going to affect our lung diameter, but that's the smooth muscle of the bronchi, not the blood vessels.
The coronary?
Nope, not a good guess. All of those are really great guesses, but obviously you guys don't remember. It is the one that affects our erectile tissue. the engorgement of blood into the penis, the engorgement of blood into the clitoris and the labia, erectile tissue. That arousal, remember, is a parasympathetic reflex. Right, so that is the only blood vessels that are controlled by the parasympathetic. When it comes to systemic blood vessels, when it comes to blood pressure, it's just the sympathetic that affects it. So notice, both by affecting the strength of the heartbeat and by directly controlling the blood vessels, our sympathetic has a much stronger control over blood pressure than our parasympathetic does. Will decreasing the heart rate affect blood pressure? Yeah, but it's an indirect effect. Whereas making the heartbeat stronger, changing the diameter of blood vessels is a direct effect on blood pressure. Now, there are a whole lot of words on this page here. So let's look at the simple, pretty picture from your textbook. Notice parasympathetic vagus nerve starts in the medulla. That single nerve comes out, comes directly to our ganglia, our terminal ganglia that are right here next to the heart. And notice it innervates the SA node and the AV node. Whereas our sympathetic travels down the spinal cord to the lateral gray horn, out the ventral root to the spinal nerve, down the white ramus, up to our cervical chain ganglia or trunk ganglia. Remember, you can use either of those terms, where it's synapses. And then our sympathetic nerve goes to the heart, where it innervates not just the SA node, not just the AV node, but it also innervates the Purkinje fibers of the ventricle, allowing it to affect not just heart rate, but also the strength of the contraction as well. At least as I warned my students in 430, probably some of the most important information you learn in 430 is that autonomic nervous system. And as I warned you, I know it was the end of the semester and everybody was exhausted, but this autonomic stuff we're going to use again and again and again. So it is important to recall that information. And if your 430 instructor did you the disservice of not emphasizing the autonomic nervous system, then I encourage you to email them and ask for your money back. All right. Questions on this? All right, excellent. Okay, excellent. From here, we can now talk. We've talked about all the electrical activity. We've talked about the structures in the heart that make them. We've talked about how those signals spread. We've talked about how we can measure how those signals spread and how we can relate them and why they're important. We've even now talked about how we can control that electrical activity. So now, finally, we can talk about the mechanical events of the heart. And the mechanical events of the heart are what are known as the cardiac cycle. And of course, what's the key word in that phrase?
Cycle.
Cycle, meaning it is a continuous process. Again, we know they follow, we know they're related to the electrical activity, the electrical events. But again, the electrical events at ECG is not a direct measure of it. There you go. And their goal of these movements is to move the blood through the heart. So the cardiac cycle is all of the mechanical events that are involved in one heartbeat. I make a point of emphasizing this because on the exam, there could very easily be an essay question where you're asked to describe the cardiac cycle. And if you tell me how blood enters into the right atrium from the superior vena cava, passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, out the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs, back the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, where it then goes through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, pumped out through the aortic semilunar valve into the ascending aorta and out to your body. Have I just described the cardiac cycle?
Yeah.
No. I have just described how a drop of blood might move through the heart, but that is not the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle are the events that are occurring in the heart. And if you think about it, we've already hit what they're going to be. The heart starts at rest, then the atria are going to contract, and the atria are going to relax. Then the ventricle is going to contract, and the ventricles are going to relax. And now the heart is back into a full state of relaxation. That is one cardiac cycle. So cardiac cycle basically is a fancy way of saying what is happening in one heartbeat. And how many heartbeats do you have in a minute on average?
100?
100.
Well, okay, if you measured your heart rate right now, would it be 100?
No.
No, what's your heart rate while you're sitting here right now?
60 to 80.
70,
All
60.
right, 60 to 80, said we'll keep 70 is a good number. So if your heart rate was 70 right now, how many cardiac cycles would you be having a minute?
70.
70. See how easy that was? You'd have 70, exactly, right? So notice we're not tracing the blood through the heart. We are measuring all of the mechanical activities in one heartbeat. And of course, it is a cycle. So, and of course, what drives this movement of blood? What makes the world go round?
Pressure.
There you go. I know some people think love makes the world go round. Some people think money makes the world go round. Pressure is what makes the world go round. And how do we change pressure in the heart?
The muscle fibers contracting.
Right. And when the muscle fibers contract, what do they do to the heart?
Make it smaller.
Yeah. We change volume. And when we change volume, we change pressure. Right? Think of it this way. If our volume increases, what happens to pressure?
Decreases.
Pressure decreases. And so then conversely, if our volume decreases, what happens?
Pressure increases.
There you go. So by changing the volume of the chambers of the heart, we change the pressures. And when we change the pressures, blood moves. Because blood, like all fluids, want to move from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to change the volume, which is going to change the pressure, which is going to move the blood. There we go. And of course, we have fancy names. We could just say contraction of the chamber of the heart or relaxation of the chamber of the heart, but we do have fancy names. What is the fancy name we use for when a chamber is in a state of contraction? I know you know it, even if you don't know, you know it, because again, like any good 50-year-old, I make sure I see my doctor on a bi-daily basis. And when I'm there every other day with my doctor, the first thing they do is take my blood pressure. And the good news is for me, my blood pressure is very, very stable. Pretty much every time I come in, you can clock it like, like clockwork, that it is going to be a very solid 325 over 217 consistently every time I go into the doctor's office, right where I like it. That's my nice meaty wheelhouse, right? What the heck does that mean? when people measure the blood pressure, what are they talking about? There you go. Philip's got it. Systolic over diastolic. Basically, the first number is the pressure in the heart when the ventricle is contracting. And the second number is the pressure in your heart when the ventricle is relaxed. So when the heart isn't, when a chamber is a state of contraction, it is in a state of systole. Or we say it is systolic. If a heart is in a state of relaxation, it is a state of diastole. Or we say it is diastolic. So systolic and diastolic are those names that fancy names we use for, again, when we're talking about blood pressure, we are talking really about those states, the systolic and diastolic of the ventricles. But as we know, are the ventricles the only chambers that can contract and relax?
No.
No. So we can use systolic and diastolic for both atria and ventricles. And of course, is that really my blood pressure?
Probably not.
No.
No, of course not. It's
You'd be dead.
much closer to 295 over 217. So and not anywhere near that. All right, excellent. Here is the pretty picture from your textbook. How are we on time? We're good. All right, here's the pretty picture from the textbook. Anytime we do these more elaborate physiological processes, I like to go through it twice. The first time, I will do it on the board. When I'm doing this on the board, I strongly encourage you to just put your pen and pencils down, just watch, listen, and think about the process. Once we've gone through the process on the whiteboard together, then we'll go to all the pretty pictures in your textbook and describe all the process and discuss all the processes and everything that are going on. And that's when you can write to your heart's content. If, while I'm explaining this the first time, you're furiously trying to write down everything that I'm saying, then you're not listening to what I'm saying. You're not comprehending or processing what I'm saying. So trust me, we'll have plenty of time for you to go back and write to your heart's content, furiously move with your pen. But for this first time, I really encourage you to just put your pen and pencil down and just watch and think. Now, one last thing. Here we actually have the nice, pretty pictures of the heart, where, of course, we have our atria, our right atrium with the superior and inferior vena cava coming in, all the blood vessels feeding into the left atrium. We have our ventricles feeding upward and out into the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta. So this is what a real heart looks like. But as you know, I'm not a good artist. So for simplicity's sake, we'll just go with that schematic drawing of the heart again. No, don't want it in blue. So of course, this is my heart. I think I can get away with it being this big. I think I can get away with, let's do 6. All righty. What chamber of the heart is this one right here?
Right atria.
Excellent. What are the great vessels that feed into the right atrium?
Superior vena cava.
Inferior.
Inferior. Excellent. That, of course, makes this the right ventricle. And what is the great vessel that receives blood from the right ventricle?
Wouldn't that be the pulmonary trunk?
It would indeed. Excellent. Would blood vessels feed into the left atrium?
Pulmonary vein.
There we go. And again, we know there are 4 of those. And what great vessel receives the blood from the left ventricle? Send in aorta. Excellent. Perfect. Excellent. I feel like my drawing's missing something though. What's my drawing missing?
The valves.
Valves. There you go. And valves come in 2 flavors. What are the 2 flavors of valves?
Semilunar and pulmonary.
Semilunar and pulmonary. Excellent. Semilunar are the ones that, of course, are between the ventricles and the great vessels. The pulmonary semilunar valve is on the right side. The aortic semilunar valve is on the left side. And when the entire heart is at rest, what is the state of the semilunar valves? Are they open or are they closed?
Closed.
Closed, absolutely. So let's draw a couple semilunar valves and let's make them closed. The others, as was mentioned, are the atrioventricular valves. And when the entire heart is at rest, what is the state of the atrioventricular valves?
Are they open?
They are indeed open. So notice at this point right here, there are basically 4 things we want to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to the state of the atria. We want to pay attention to the state of the ventricles. I'm just going to abbreviate ventricle just there to make it a little simpler. We need to know the state of the AV valves. And we need to know the state of the semilunar valves. Now, as we just mentioned, our AV valves are open. Our semilunar valves are closed. And if both our heart is entirely at rest, what is the state of both the atria and the ventricles?
Diastole.
Diastole. Excellent. And this is our starting point. Again, it's a cycle, so it's a continuous process, but this is our starting point. All right, it's a good starting point, so we'll start here. Questions on this? All right. So let's think about what's going on right now. Right now, while the heart is at rest, we know that there is constantly blood coming back from our body into the right atrium, constantly blood from our lungs, and we should probably add that. I'm not sure it's necessarily relevant for what we're talking about, but this is from the body and this is from the lungs. Doesn't hurt. Whereas this is to the lungs and this is to the body. Like I said, I'm not 100% certain it's relevant for this, but it doesn't hurt to say that. As this blood enters into the atria, is it just going to stay there? No. Notice as it continues to fill with blood, its pressure will start to increase. And most of the time you're sitting upright or standing upright. So you also have gravity helping as well. So notice what's going to happen is that blood is going to flow right on from the atria into the ventricles, and we're going to start to get the filling of the ventricles with blood. This is what we actually call our passive filling of the ventricles. And in fact, about 80% of the blood that gets into the ventricles gets there from this passive filling. All right. Questions on this? Everybody understand our starting point? All right, so while I'm drawing my next heart, someone tell me what's the first thing that's going to happen?
Atriums contract.
Exactly. All right, we know our sinoatrial node is going to produce an action potential. That action potential is going to spread. Did I say sinoatrial node? I don't remember if I did or not, so I'll make sure I'm saying it correctly. Your sinoatrial node is going to produce an action potential. That action potential is going to spread across the atria, and as it spreads across the atria, it is going to cause the cardiac muscle of the atria to contract. So notice if we're coming here, we'll write it at the end. Blue for those. So again, blood is still coming in here. It is still being moved into the heart, but now we are getting the contraction of the atria. And so as the atria contract, they are now using ATP. So we are now getting the active of the ventricles, where we're going to get about what percentage of the blood that's going to get in here?
20.
Yeah, there you go. See how easy that was? Excellent. We're going to get that active filling of the ventricle. Notice, for the most part, not much has changed. I'm going to just abbreviate these even more now. Our atria is now in what state?
Systolic.
Systolic, excellent. Our ventricle is in what state?
Is it also systolic?
Yeah, no. Is it contracting yet?
No.
No, so it's diastolic. Has our AV valve changed its state?
Not yet.
Nope. Exactly. Notice, again, if the atria are contracting, they're making the pressure in here even greater. So now we have an even greater pressure inside here, which is going to mean that blood's going to move even more rapidly into the ventricle. So if we're increasing the pressure in the atria even more, then that means that those AV valves are going to stay open because we're forcing the blood even quicker into them. And of course, our semilunar valves are still closed. So our first goal is to get as much blood as we can into the ventricle. And notice we do that in 2 steps. First passively and then actively. All right. Questions on that? May have to cheat and make this one a little bit smaller. Make sure I have room to write around it. This is so much easier to do these drawings on the board. Well, it's easier to draw on the board, but as you will learn when we get into the classroom, my handwriting is horrible. So you're going to have fun trying to determine what that looks like. All right. So once the atria contract, what do the atria do?
Relax.
Relax. So the atria enter a state of diastole. And our ventricle is going to start systole. They're going to start to become systolic. They're going to start their contraction. The reason this is significant is as our ventricle starts to contract, what does that do to the volume of our ventricle?
Decrease and increase pressure.
Excellent. And when the volume decreases, what happens to our pressure?
Increases.
Increases. But notice, if this is just starting, then these changes are small. This is significant because what this is going to do is this increase in pressure is going to make the blood that is already here inside of the ventricle, this blood's not going to be happy. And it's going to try to want to go back to the atria, where now the atria is at a lower pressure. And when that blood tries to get back into the atria, what happens?
Valves close.
Our AV valves close. We want to make sure we're precise in our description of this. So now our atrioventricular valves close. And remember, this is when we hear the lub of our heart rate. However, notice it's just starting systole. It's just starting to increase a small amount of pressure. Is it going to be able to produce enough pressure at this period of time to cause our semilunar valves to open and shove a blood out here into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk where there's already a massive amount of blood?
No.
No. So notice at this point, while there's enough pressure to close the AV valves, there is not enough pressure to open our semilunar valves. So our semilunar valves are also still closed. So notice at this period of time, all 4 valves are closed. And if all 4 valves are closed, can we get any more blood into or out of the ventricle?
No.
At this point, it has its set volume. And we have a fancy name for that set volume. Actually, I'm going to write this down here. We have a name for this set volume. We call this the end diastolic volume. The end diastolic volume basically is the amount of blood, the maximum amount of blood that you get into the ventricle. All right. So notice our volume does not change. However, remember the ventricle is just starting to contract. And once it starts to contract, what's it going to do? It's not a trick question. Is it just going to start to contract and then just change its mind and decide not to contract?
No, it's going to continue.
No, it's going to continue to contract. And as it continues to contract, what happens to the pressure?
It increases.
Yeah. So even though our volume does not change, our pressure increases. Well, that doesn't make sense. How can that possibly be the case? Oh, that would have been so smart of me. I don't have one. All right. Let's say I had a can of soda here in front of me. Closed. So all the valves were closed on it. and I were to grab it and squeeze that can, would I be able to crush that can?
No.
No, of course not, right? Well, I appreciate the hesitation that you guys actually think that I might for a second be able to. Of course not, right? I can squeeze a little bit or more or more or more or more. Am I going to be able to change the amount of soda that is inside that can if the top is closed?
No.
No. So notice during this period of time, the ventricle is contracting harder and harder and harder and harder. The pressure is increasing, but the volume doesn't change. And we have a fancy name for this state of time. We call it the ISO, because what does ISO mean?
Same.
Same. Volumetric. Oops. The isovolumetric, same volume, contraction. So during this brief period of time, our isovolumetric contraction, the volume of blood in the chambers, in the ventricles does not change, but the pressure increases. And again, we're talking about in the ventricles. So we have this period of isovolumetric contraction. Questions on that?
No.
Excellent. All right. So let's get our heart drawn here. We're in this state where the strength of the contractions of my ventricles are getting stronger and stronger. Now, thanks to those papillary muscles and the chordae tendinea, no matter how strong the pressure in the ventricle gets, am I ever going to be able to produce enough pressure in my ventricle where my AV valves are going to open?
No.
No, right? That would be a horrible, bad thing if that happened. However, as the pressure continues to increase, as we reach a state of full systole in our ventricles, eventually can the pressure in the ventricle become greater than the pressure in the vein, in the arteries?
Yes.
That didn't need to all be in capitals, but I guess that works. Absolutely. So eventually the pressure in the ventricle is going to become greater than the pressure in the arteries. And what's going to happen when that occurs?
The semilunar valves will open.
Exactly. During this period of time, now the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the artery. And as a result of that, the blood forces those semilunar valves open and blood is released. So again, notice our atria is still diastolic. Our ventricle is now in full systole. Our AV valve is still closed, but now our semilunar valve is now open. And as a result, our blood leaves the ventricles into the arteries. And this period of time is what we call ventricular ejection. Notice this is when we're forcing more blood into the blood vessels. And we force more blood into the blood vessels, that increases our blood pressure. So when you're measuring that systolic pressure on someone, this is what you're measuring. What the pressure in their elastic blood vessels are when the ventricle is forcing that blood into the arteries.
I have a question.
I have an answer.
Why aren't there any valves upon entering the atriums?
So short answer, of course, is why is one of those questions that we don't fully know the answer to all the time, because again, the engineer who designed this did not leave us the footnotes. But the simple, easy answer is, as we'll see, blood pressure isn't only important for moving blood through the heart, it's important for moving blood through the entire cardiovascular system. Just the same way a ball rolls down a hill, blood moves down its pressure gradient. And when that blood comes back, as that blood is entering into the atria from the superior vena cava, the appropriate blood pressure of that blood should be 0 millimeters of mercury. And if we have, oops, oh, I've got the cap lock on, that's why that looks funny. If the blood coming back here is at 0 millimeters of mercury, is that going to be easy for it to open a valve? No, so mostly we don't need it. Yeah, so mostly it's because it's not necessary. These two stop backflow. We don't really have to worry about backflow coming into the atrium. So it's a great question, but yeah, just it's not the way it's needed. All right, awesome question. Any others? All right, so let's talk while I draw my heart. Our ventricle is contracting, but is it going to contract forever?
No.
No. Eventually, it's going to start to stop contracting. And when it stops contracting, its volume is going to start to increase. And when it stops contracting, what's going to happen to its pressure?
Decrease.
Yeah. As it starts diastole, we get a decrease in pressure.
I have a question.
And, yes.
So I don't really understand how like they can start and stop diastole and when it just happened. Like I don't get why there's like a process for those two.
I'm not sure I understand your question. What?
Like I don't get why, like, so for example, in the ISO volumetric contraction, that stage, I don't get how, like, I don't know. I get how there's just like starting of a contraction. It doesn't just like happen one.
Okay, so let's think of it this way. When you go to lift up a pen, when you're producing tension in your muscle, does your muscle go from a completely relaxed state to instantly its maximal tension when you are lifting an object?
No.
No, it has to increase the amount of tension to get there. Then when you decide to relax the muscle, does the muscle instantly go to 0 tension?
No.
No, so there's going to be a decrease, a decline. And that's what we're seeing here. At the very beginning, as it's starting to contract, that pressure is enough to close the AV valves, but not enough to close to open the semilunar valves. But then when the pressure gets great enough, then it's now able to force the semilunar valves open. And then as we see here, as it starts to relax, there's a decrease in pressure. And we just rammed a whole bunch of blood into the arteries. So the arteries have a very high pressure. And is this blood here in the arteries going to want to stay here in the super high pressure environment?
No.
No. So it is going to try to sneak back into, the ventricles where the pressure is going down. And so what happens as that blood tries to get back into the ventricle? Anyone?
The valves are closed.
Yeah, and again, don't just say valves, be specific. The semilunar valves are going to close. So notice as the pressure starts to decrease, again, our AV valves, have they changed at all?
No, they're still
They're
closed.
still closed. But now our semilunar valves have now closed. And when they close, this is when we hear the dub sound. Ava, did I answer your question?
Yes, I have one more then. So why in the atrium, why doesn't it start and stop either? Like, why is it, I don't know. Maybe I'm just confused.
We'll come back to the atria. We'll talk about the atria in a second. Okay.
Okay.
But let's finish talking about what's going on in the ventricles right here.
Okay.
Notice two more things. At this point, once again, we are now at a state where all four valves are closed. Now, when the ventricle stops contracting, do you think it is completely emptied all the blood from it?
No.
No. Right? It's like a can of soda pop. No matter how much you shake that can of soda pop, there's always going to be a little bit down at the bottom. No matter how much that ventricle contracts, there's still going to be a little bit of blood left down here at the bottom. So notice when all four valves are closed, we now still have some blood in the ventricles. And this turns out to be the minimal amount of blood that you get in the ventricle. And we're going to have a name for it. And not surprisingly, that is what we call the end systolic volume. So the end systolic volume is the minimal amount of blood that you have in your heart. Notice also all four valves are closed. So once again, we're at a state where the volume of blood does not change. But, oh, I don't want this to be in capitals. But what about the pressure? Is the pressure in the ventricle changing?
I'm guessing it's going to be low pressure.
Yeah, as it continues to relax, the pressure continues to go down and down and down. So notice the pressure in the ventricles continues to drop. So notice it decreases. So volume of blood stays the same, but our pressure decreases. So guess what we call this brief period of time? Well, the volume's not changing, so let's start with the easy part. What do you think the term we use for when the volume doesn't change is?
Isovolumetric.
Oops. Excellent. Before we had, while the pressure was increasing, we had an isovolumetric contraction. Now the volume is decreasing because what is the ventricle doing? It's not contracting anymore, it's
Relaxing.
relaxing. So this is our isovolumetric relaxation.
Can I piggyback off of Ava's initial question?
Absolutely.
So would understanding the isovolumetric contraction and relaxation be similar to understanding the purpose of the atrioventricular node?
No. The atrioventricular node, oh, great question. The goal of, so great question. I'll tell you what, let me finish this. And then once we finish this, we know the electrical activity relates to these mechanical activity. So let's go back and layer that on top of this. So let's finish the rest of this cycle first, and then we'll come back and we'll relate the electrical activity to this mechanical activity and see if we can figure out how they relate. Again, remember, it's not a direct measure, but absolutely they relate. Okay. So let's do that. That's an awesome question, but let's finish this first because that could take a little bit of time and it'll be a good way to review this material. So let's do that, but let's finish up what's going to happen here. So I need to move this all over so I have some room to write. All right. We know our atria is in a state of diastole. And I'm running out of space, so I'll just put a big fat D. Our ventricle is now completely relaxed. So it's in full diastolic. Right? We know our semilunar valves are closed. These are all things that we know that's been happening, but notice we haven't, as Ava pointed out earlier, really talked about what's been going on in our atria. Notice we've been focusing on all these pressure changes and the closing and the opening and the closing of the valves and all that. But notice the whole time this has been happening, blood from the lungs, blood from the body has been slowly coming back into the atria, continuing to come back in the whole time. As I mentioned earlier, it is very low pressure blood. So even as it continues to fill more and more, it's still a very low pressure blood. But it is slowly increasing. So when the pressure of that passive filling finally becomes greater than the pressure in the relaxed ventricle, what's going to happen?
The AV valve will open?
Exactly. This higher pressure in the atria will then finally cause the AV valves to open. Notice none of these cells of the heart are contracting. It's just this passive filling has led to a passive increase in pressure, which is now allowing the blood to open the AV valves and fill the ventricles. And what would we call what's going on right here?
Ventricle filling.
Right, and more specifically, because we're not using ATP, it'd be the passive filling of the ventricles. And why does that term sound familiar?
That's what we
It's what
started
we
with.
started with.
It's because that's exactly where we started. And our cycle continues. All right, now let's answer your question. What color haven't I used? I haven't used brown. Let's go with brown. We know that these mechanical events are related to the electrical events. So notice the heart goes from a state where it is fully at rest to a state where the atria is in a state of systole. Why? What's happened?
The action potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what happened is our sinoatrial node, the sinoatrial node fired and spread an action potential. And that spread of the action potential caused the atria to contract. Now notice the ventricles are not contracting at the same time. Why are the ventricles not contracting at the same time?
The atrioventricular node.
Yeah, the AV node is slowing the signal. But eventually, does that electrical signal reach the apex and start to spread up the ventricle?
Yes.
And as it starts to spread, notice it's going to start, because only a few cells are excited at first, only a few cells are contracting. So we're going to get a weak contraction, just the start of the contraction of the ventricle. But once the full ventricle is excited, then the full ventricle is contracting, producing a powerful contraction that is causing the blood to be ejected. But then the ventricle, we see the T wave, the ventricle starts to repolarize. And as it starts to repolarize, it starts to relax. And as it starts to relax, the pressure goes down. And that drop in pressure causes the semilunar valves to close until the full heart is repolarized. And now we're back at our starting point and ready for the AV node, the SA node to fire another action potential and for the process to continue. So notice we can see how the electrical activity is going to drive this process. But remember, it's just not a direct measure. If the P wave is 10 milliseconds, we know that the atrial contraction is not 10 milliseconds. We just know that that P wave is going to cause the atria to contract. Did that answer your question? Do we see how these are related?
It answered mine.
Okay, excellent. What about you, Ava? This make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Excellent. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead. I'm sorry?
Can you save it and post it on modules?
Yes, I think I will do that right now. Excellent. So this is perfect. This is a perfect stopping point. We're going to go ahead and take our second break here. We will come back in 15 minutes at 10:56. I will leave this up here to sink in for you. And then I'll restart. And then we'll be able to go through the entire thing again with all the pretty pictures and all the pretty words from your textbook and from your outlines. So we will go through this entire process a second time, make sure it makes sense. And then in a very cool and clever way, we're going to go through this a third time. Looking at the pressure. Well, no, we're not going to do it in lab, although that would be awesome. No, we're going to look at it by looking at the pressures and seeing just how much sense this all actually makes. So we're all going to actually make this make sense to you, I promise. But let's go ahead and take our break first, our last break, and then we'll come back and we'll go through the entire process again. So it's okay if it's overwhelmed. Give this a few minutes to sink in. Take a few minutes to weep openly or whatever it is that you need, and then we'll come back and make sure that this makes sense. All right, questions on that? All righty, I will see you guys in 15 minutes. All righty. Home stretch. So now we can start putting some of the pieces together. For our cardiac cycle, notice one of the things we just finished talking about was our stroke volume. Someone remind me again of what the definition of the stroke volume is?
And diastolic volume minus and systolic volume.
So that is how you calculate it.
The
The
amount
volume
of blood
from the
moved by one
ventricle.
ventricle in one cardiac cycle.
Excellent. Okay, hold on. And diastolic volume minus the end Systolic volume. Excellent. Oops. So what was that definition again?
The amount of blood moved by one ventricle in one cardiac cycle.
Excellent. There you go. One ventricle and one cardiac cycle. Apparently this is too big, so let's make it a little bit smaller. Excellent. Actually, I don't like it. I like it big. Perfect. So we defined it as the amount of blood moved in one ventricle in one cardiac cycle, and we know how to calculate it. Excellent. Is there a term we would use for the definition of the amount of cardiac cycles? You have in a minute. What would the term we would use for that?
Beats
The
per minute.
cardiac output.
What would it be?
I said beats per minute.
Okay, sure, absolutely. One way we could describe that is the beats per minute.
Your heart rate.
How about just heart rate? Absolutely. Beats per minute is totally acceptable as well, but how about something simple like just heart rate? Absolutely. And of course, is there really a way to calculate that? No, but how would you measure it?
Counting your beats.
Yeah, you basically just put your hand over one of someone's elastic blood vessels and you just count it, right? You measure it by counting and looking at the clock. You will be doing this in class on Monday. You'll be taking heart rates from each other. Absolutely. So basically you put your hand on the carotid artery or the radial artery, right? Something like that, and count the number of pulsations you feel. Absolutely. So this leads us to our cardiac output. We define our cardiac output then as the amount of blood pumped from one ventricle in 1 minute of time. And how would we calculate something like that?
Is it the heart rate times the stroke volume?
There you go. It really is just that simple. Heart rate times the stroke volume. There you go. Absolutely. So again, heart rate, we just measure the cardiac cycle. Single cardiac cycle takes about 0.8 seconds. So let's give an average of 75 beats per minute. Stroke volume, as we mentioned, is the volume of blood pumped from one ventricle with each heartbeat, with each cardiac cycle. And what did we say the stroke volume was again on average?
70, 60 to 80.
Yeah, 70 milliliters per volume, absolutely. And so then our cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by one ventricle in 1 minute of time. And as we just finished mentioning, you can calculate the cardiac output by heart rate times stroke volume. Now we just came up with a average heart rate of 75 because it's a nice round number, a stroke volume of 70 milliliters because it's a nice round number. So if we multiply those two together, what is our average cardiac output?
5,250.
There we go. Now, I have a question. We haven't talked about blood yet in the cardiovascular system, but anybody know about what your average volume of blood in your body is?
Is it 3 liters?
A little more than 3.
3.5.
Not quite that, a little bit more than that, but less than 8. Split the difference.
7, 5.
Yeah,
3,
5 to 6. You have about 5.5 to 6 liters of blood in your body. So notice every minute your heart pumps your entire volume of blood through the heart. So every minute your entire blood supply basically is going through your heart. And this is at rest. If we increase the heart rate with your physical activity, what's going to happen to your cardiac output?
Going to increase?
It's going to increase as well. Absolutely. We actually have a number for that. We call it the cardiac reserve. The cardiac reserve is basically the cardiac output of your maximum versus your cardiac output at rest. And for average individuals like you and me, our cardiac reserve is about 4 or 5. So let's figure that out. If your cardiac reserve was 5 and your cardiac output at rest was 5 liters, what would your cardiac output be when you were at your maximal cardiac output?
25?
25, right? 5 times 5, 25. So when you're physically active, your heart is pumping 25 liters of blood through it in a single minute of time. And that's us mere mortals. The Olympics is getting ready to begin, and some professional athletes can have a cardiac output as much as a cardiac reserve as much as 7 or 8, meaning that in a single minute of time, 35 liters of blood is passing through just one of their ventricles. As I said, the heart may not be impressive to look at, but from a functional standpoint, it is truly amazing. And like I said, it doesn't even take Sundays off. No national holidays, right? 24/7. All right. Notice one other thing then. Is it important to modify our cardiac output? Be able to change our cardiac output? Yeah. So what are the two things you could influence to change your cardiac output?
Hormones?
Okay, those are the mechanisms, but if we want to directly affect cardiac output, what can we change?
Breathe faster.
Yeah, how about heart rate and stroke volume? If we change the heart rate, are we going to change the cardiac output?
Yeah.
If we change the stroke volume, are we going to change cardiac output? Now you're right. We're going to change heart rate by doing things like moving, like doing things like using hormones. But the key is if we want to change our cardiac output, we need to be able to change our heart rate or change our stroke volume. And you guys absolutely have the right idea. Using hormones, using things like activity, we can change our heart rate, and that will change the cardiac output. And since stroke volume is determined by our end diastolic volume and our end systolic volume, anything that changes these will change our stroke volume, will change our cardiac output. So let's talk about how we'll do that. And we'll start with heart rate first, because I think it's the one that's more intuitive. As we mentioned, we have these pathways for the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which can increase our heart rate. One of the main ways or reasons we change our heart rate while we're sitting at rest is because, as we talk about, the amount of blood we pump into the vessels affects the blood pressure. So is it important to know what our blood pressure is to understand if our heart is functioning properly? Hold
Yes.
on. Sure, there are lots of things that hormones and other techniques that Olympians can use or other athletes can use to improve their function. None of them directly make the heart work better. But so we will talk about those. We'll talk about those more when we get to hormones and stuff like that. So it isn't so much about, it doesn't affect heart rate. All those performance enhancing things, none of them involve increasing heart rate or increasing the strength of those contractions. All right, so absolutely, the amount of blood we pump into the vessels affects our blood pressure. So one of the important things we need to monitor is indeed our blood pressure. Blood pressure, as we said, is the force of the blood pushing against our blood vessels. And since our blood vessels have some elasticity, they have some stretch, there are baroreceptors that measure the stretch of the blood vessel. And based on that, they can change our heart rate. Let's think about some easy examples of this. Again, as we think about, just like we did in 430, our goal is to maintain homeostasis. So we start with a disturbance. Once we have a disturbance, if we're going to resolve that disturbance, what do we need?
We need to send it to the
Receptor.
Yeah, we need receptor, exactly. Right now, if there was a fire alarm going off in room 418 in our classroom, would that affect our behavior right now?
No.
No, because none of us are in 418. So none of us are hearing it. None of us are aware of it. So the first thing we have to have is a receptor. That sends the information to the command center to process the information, make sense of the information. And then once a decision is made, we send a signal to where?
Effector.
Say again?
Effector.
Yeah, the effector.
Yeah.
That is going to bring the body back into balance. Excellent. So let's take the example here. The disturbance is an increase in blood pressure. Blood pressure goes up. When blood pressure in a blood vessel goes up, is it going to stretch the blood vessel more or stretch the blood vessel less?
Stretch the blood vessel more.
Yeah. So this increases the stretch of the blood vessel. Luckily, we have these baroreceptors. And these baroreceptors measure the stretch of the blood vessel. And as they are stretched, as they're stretched more, they fire more action potentials. So now our command center in the medulla of the brain receives the signal that the blood pressure is increasing in this blood vessel. So what is it going to do? What are the effectors it would want to send a signal? It wants to bring blood pressure back down. So it's going to send a signal to what specific effector? Or effectors?
The heart.
Yeah, right? Remember, heart rate can affect blood pressure. So what would it want to tell the heart to do?
Beat faster. Or
If we
harder?
beat faster, remember the problem is our blood pressure went up. If I beat faster, is that going to resolve that issue?
No, so slower.
Yeah. Right. This will lower heart rate. That lowering the heart rate lowers the blood pressure, because if our heart rate goes down, what effect does that have on our cardiac output?
It would go down as well.
Decreases. And if our cardiac output decreases, there's less blood into the blood vessels, and as a result of that, blood pressure decreases. So notice by affecting heart rate, we affected cardiac output and we brought the blood pressure back into balance. And just out of curiosity, which branch of our nervous system would we want to have used to bring that heart rate down?
Parasympathetic.
Yeah. Excellent. And of course, is this going to work the opposite way as well?
Yes.
Yeah. If there's a decrease in blood pressure, baroreceptors stretch less, fire fewer action potentials. Goes to the medulla. Medulla sees that blood pressure is down, wants to bring BP up. So what branch of the nervous system is it going to use?
Sympathetic.
Excellent. It's going to use the sympathetic pathway, and that sympathetic pathway is going to tell the heart to beat faster. So what happens to heart rate?
Increases.
What happens to cardiac output?
Increases.
And now we're putting more blood into the arteries. And if we're putting more blood into arteries, what happens to the blood pressure?
Increases.
And there you go. Just that simply, by changing the heart rate, we've changed our cardiac output. We've brought our blood pressure back into balance. All right. Now, of course, there are other ways we can affect heart rate. Certain chemicals in our body have the ability to affect it. Hormones, our stress hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Thyroid hormones like triiodothyronine and thyroxine, which for now you can call T3 and T4. They increase general metabolism of the body. So those are all things that can bring it up. But ion imbalances can affect heart rate. Right? And there are other factors as well. Age, gender, physical fitness, temperature. How does temperature affect heart rate? How does temperature affect heart rate?
If you're cold, your heart rate beats usually slower, and if you're hot, it's usually.
It's one of the major concerns with those polar plunges, right? New Year's was right around the corner. And one of the things they do, like in places like Chicago and other areas like that, or Minnesota, where things get really, really cold, one of the fun ways they ring in the new year is with a polar plunge, where they cut a big hole in the ice in the water and they go and they dive right into it. It's all shocking, it's all exciting, it's all fun, except that rapid decrease in body temperature can actually send a signal that I can actually rapidly depress your heart rate. And in rare but extreme instances, it's actually possible to get the heart to stop beating from that rapid change in temperature. All right. Things like pain. How does physical fitness typically affect heart rate?
When you're more fit, you usually have a lower heart rate.
Yeah, obviously when you're the more active you are, the more physical your heart rate is. But at rest, right, the heart is a muscle just like anything else. And so if you're very physically active and very physically fit, the heart as a muscle tends to work more efficiently. And so when you're at rest, heart rate tends to actually go down, tends to decrease. Excellent. All right. So all of these are things that can affect heart rate. And less intuitively, we can affect stroke volume as well. Now, if you think about this with stroke volume, here, of course, is our ventricle. And in our ventricle, we have two goals. One goal is to, get blood into the ventricle, but one is to get blood out of the ventricle. How we get blood into the ventricle are things that affect the end diastolic volume. And our ability to get blood out affects our end systolic volume. Think of this in terms of a water balloon. If I've got a water balloon and I want to fill it with water, I connect it to the faucet, to the nozzle part, and I turn on the faucet. Is there a way I can change how quickly it fills with water? How? How can I get more water into that water balloon? I take that water balloon, I put it on the faucet, I turn the faucet on for 5 seconds, and I get a set amount of water. Is there any way I can change how much water I get into that water balloon?
If you add more water to it.
Right. What if I turn up the faucet so it runs faster? Will I get more water into that balloon?
Yes.
Yep.
Absolutely. Remember, I talked about how that blood in the veins is at very low pressure and very sludgingly coming back. But then that bear with an axe walks into the room. And when the bear with an axe walks into the room and you have that stress response, remember, one of the things that happens systemically is our blood vessels systemically, our veins constrict. That's why our face gets pale, because remember in 430, we learned how our skin is a blood reservoir. Well, we can make that blood go back to the heart more rapidly. So one thing we can do is we can increase our venous return, make the blood come back faster. That'd be like turning the faucet on. Is there any other way that I could get more water into that water balloon?
Couldn't you increase the blood vessel radius?
Well, okay, you would decrease, well, increasing it would increase blood flow to bring it back, to make it, but in this case, we want to squeeze them and get them to come back. So yes, by changing the diameter of the blood vessels, we can get the blood to come back more quickly, right? But as I said, if I'm going to put that water balloon on there for 5 seconds and fill it with water, is there a way I can get more water into that balloon?
With more pressure also.
True, we could change the pressures to get the blood back to come back more, but notice I keep saying 5 seconds. Do I actually have to leave the water balloon on there for just 5 seconds?
No.
What if I leave it on there for 10 seconds? Will that get more water inside of it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so notice the other thing we can do is we can prolong how long or increase, let's say it that way. I don't like prolong, how long. We can increase how long the ventricle is in diastole. This actually does two things. What's cool about this is this obviously gets more blood into the ventricle, but it also does something else. It also stretches the ventricle, right? Just like if I put water in a water balloon, it stretches that water balloon out. If you remember in 430, one of the things when we were talking about skeletal muscle that affects how much tension it can produce is the length of the muscle fiber. Remember, for instance, we use the example, if I pulled your arm way behind you and I'm holding it back there, are you going to easily be able to pull your arm away from me?
No.
No, because that muscle is stretched out so much that it's not able to produce a very effective contraction. Well, it turns out as the heart stretches, it actually becomes more effective. And if you can produce a more powerful contraction, can you pump more blood out?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you overfill it too much, is it still, I mean, is there a limit to how much you can stretch it and have this effect? Yes, of course. And there's a fancy name for this. This is the, we'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to talk about the concepts first. But yes, so these are ways that we can increase how much blood we are getting into the ventricle, and then this added effect of a more powerful contraction. The other issue, remember, the other big key we have to deal with is we have to make more pressure in the ventricle than in the artery. So remember, we talked about blood pressure, and what's a normal systolic blood pressure? What do we typically think of as the average blood pressure in the
120.
120, right? 120 millimeters of mercury. So obviously our ventricle needs to be able to produce enough pressure to force blood out by making a pressure greater than 120. But what if you have chronic high blood pressure? What if instead the blood pressure in your arteries is 150? Does that make it easier or harder for the ventricle to get blood out?
Harder?
Harder. And if it's harder, is it going to be able to move as much blood?
No.
No. So notice this high blood pressure makes the heart have to work harder on every single pump to be able to move out the same amount of blood, because this increased blood pressure basically decreases how much blood the heart can actually move. Now we have fancy terms for all of these things. The ability to increase our end diastolic volume is what is known as the preload, right? Basically, we can get more blood coming back more quickly, or we can leave the ventricle relaxed more. And remember, I mentioned there's this Frank-Starling law of the heart, where as it stretches, the force it produces increases. Frank and Starling are two cardiovascular researchers. One was in England, one was in the United States. They both basically discovered this characteristic of the heart at a very similar time, both presented it at a very similar time, and a huge, massive, not physical brawl, but educational brawl basically came out of this in trying to argue over who got to plant their flag in it and claim this property for their own. And you can, while it's a long, incredibly boring story, you can see what the ultimate output was. They both got their name on it. So both of them got to plant their flag on it, and nobody was happy, which is always the best kind of compromise. So again, the more we stretch it, the more powerful that contraction is going to be. That's that Frank-Starling law. We also have how much contraction we can take. Some of that can be intrinsic, ion concentrations, things along those lines. But remember also, our sympathetic nervous system has the ability to affect the Purkinje cells. And if it contracts more powerfully, it's going to move more blood. But things like hormones or ion levels can change how strong the ventricle contracts. And as I mentioned, we also have this afterload. We have to overcome the pressure in the arteries to pump blood out of the heart. And that is why chronic hypertension is such a dangerous condition. You think of the fact that your heart is beating on average 75 times per minute. If each one of those pumps is not moving the same amount of blood, you have a decreased cardiac output. Then to meet the needs of your body, your heart has to beat faster. So now you're doing much more work, much less effectively, and it puts a tremendous amount of strain on the heart with every single beat. All right. And again, we even got a pretty picture from your textbook that talks about that as well. Having to be able to overcome that blood pressure in the artery to be able to force that open and get the blood out. Your book's got one of these nice. So again, if our goal was to increase cardiac output, there are several things that could affect this. And we talked about all that to affect stroke volume, to affect heart rate, to affect our cardiac output. Last thing we need to talk about is what happens if you're not able to pump enough blood to meet the demands of the body. We call that condition congestive heart failure. And with congestive heart failure, basically, again, as we talked about, the heart are basically two independent pumps that work together. So when you have congestive heart failure, do both sides stop working equally poorly, or does it typically affect one side more than the other?
One side.
Yeah, it's typically going to affect one side more than the other. So when it affects one side, we actually call it pulmonary congestion. When it affects the other side, we call it peripheral congestion. So let's figure out which is which. Here are our two pumps. Our right side and our left side. Our right side receives blood from where again?
The body.
And sends blood where?
Lungs.
Our left side receives blood from
The lungs.
Lungs
and sends blood where?
to the body.
Excellent. So if I had pulmonary congestion, which side of the heart would be having problems?
The right side.
Exactly, absolutely. If you were having pulmonary congestion, the left side of the heart would be the one having problems. Wait, what? Didn't you say right?
The right side would struggle because, yeah, I said right. I
Yeah,
think.
but I wrote left. Did I spell it wrong?
No, it's because it's coming in
No.
No,
hard
you're
from
not.
the left.
No, one of the reasons I want to go over this is because it's not intuitive. You've absolutely got the right idea. The right side is the site that is pumping the blood to the lungs, but let's see what's actually happening here. And again, we're going to use completely artificial numbers. These are not true at all, as we know, but it's going to serve our point. Let's say, for instance, that 10 milliliters of blood is coming back to our heart from the body. And then, of course, it is going to pump 10 milliliters out with every cardiac output, with every cardiac cycle. So how much blood is coming back from the lungs on the left side?
10.
10.
And how much leaves the left side?
The same 10.
10 milliliters. So let's say the problem was with the right side. If the problem was with the right side, then instead, if it wasn't as effective, only 7, or let's go even easier numbers, only 5 milliliters gets pumped out. So how much comes back to the other side?
5 milliliters.
5 milliliters. And 5 milliliters get pumped out here. But we still have 10 milliliters coming back from the body. So if only 5 left, how much stayed behind?
5.
5.
And now the right side pumps a second time, only moving 5. And now there's 10 that stayed behind. And then it pumps a third time, and there's 15 milliliters that stayed behind. And then it pumps a fourth time, and suddenly there's 20 milliliters staying behind. Notice what starts to happen is we start to get the backup of blood, the congestion, backs up into the blood vessels of the body. So when the right side's not working properly, the blood backs up into the body. You start to get swelling in the appendages, especially in the feet and legs when you're standing. Your joints can get tight. They can get sore from all of that swelling. You have trouble getting your rings off and things along those lines from this accumulation of blood that it's working its way back into the body. So notice the blood with peripheral congestion, blood backs up into the systemic veins, and that causes peripheral congestion when the right side is damaged.
But wouldn't that cause your left side to work harder?
Probably. I mean, because again, it's able to move all the blood that it's getting. So it's still, as soon as it's getting blood, it's shoving it out into the body. The problem is it's backing up on the body side. And often, while it starts asymmetrical, does congestive heart failure often spread to both halves? Yeah, exactly for that reason. Notice then, if we flipped it around, oops, hold on, let's see if that right. If now it was the left side that was only pumping out 5 milliliters, whereas this one could move 10, right? And you're getting 10 to come back in. With damage to the left side, where is the blood congesting and backing up now?
Pulmonary.
Right, back into the lungs. So now you have difficulty breathing, especially when you're laying down. Increase in likelihood of pneumonia and other type of respiratory disorders from this, as you fatigue very rapidly because, again, you're having trouble getting oxygen from your blood and going back. So it is indeed the left side, because when the left side has problems, the blood backs up into the lungs. I greatly appreciate you speaking up and answering that question, because I know it purposely was a trap, and I know tons of other people were thinking that the pulmonary would be the right side because that's the intuitive answer. That is, after all, the pump that associates with the lungs. So I promise you other people were thinking as well. So I greatly appreciate you answering that. But that's also why I wanted to take the time to go over this, because this isn't intuitive. It seems the opposite of what it should be. But once you think about how it works and where the blood is going to back up from the damaged part of the heart, then hopefully that helps it to make some sense. Excellent. So questions on that? All right, awesome. Believe it or not, you now know everything you need to know about the heart. So on Monday, not only do we get to start in person, you get to see my legs, I get to see more than black boxes, but we also get to move forward onto the blood vessels. We'll start talking about the anatomy and function and then control of the blood vessels, and we'll have some fun physiology labs that we'll be doing in the classroom. Not a bad idea to read them ahead of time so you know what to expect. Again, it is pages 494 through 515 in your lab manual. All right. Any questions on any of that? All right, excellent. We snuck it in. 5 minutes to spare. All right, you guys have an excellent day and an excellent weekend. Study hard. And like I said, unless something really, really terrible happens, I am looking forward to seeing you in class bright and early on Monday morning. Of course, that means we all have to shower and brush our teeth. That we haven't had to do that in a while. So, but we'll all do that, and we'll all be there. Start at 8. So be there 5 minutes early. All right. See you guys.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.